In order to fulfill his role as chief executive, Washington established his cabinet, which was composed of the leaders of the executive departments. The Department of State is responsible for the diplomatic matters of the United States, and the first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. The Department of Treasury is the chief banker of the United States and was first overseen by Alexander Hamilton. The Department of Justice was the dominion of the Attorney General, and Anthony Rednoff would be the first Attorney General. And the Department of War, which would be in charge of the defense of the nation, was under the leadership of Henry Knox. The Supreme Court was the only court created by the Constitution, and the only member specifically mentioned was the presiding officer, the Chief Justice. Congress was given the authority to create as many levels as jurisdiction of courts and many justices and judges as deemed necessary. Washington selected John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It's important to know who was the first. To calm fears about an overbearing national government, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution to ensure that the rights of the citizen, as well as the state and the new government. It was ratified in 1791. When the Constitution was ratified, the United States was the only nation in the world that did not, in some form, sponsor a set religion or mandate some of its religious requirements to hold office. In the First Amendment, Congress was forbidden from endorsing a religious or preventing others from worship as they saw fit. The Constitution authorized Congress to create policies regarding the immigration and naturalization of citizens. George Washington held that the nation needed to embrace new immigrants and refugees and urged Congress in his first address to the legislative branch in 1790 to set as a priority. The Naturalization Act of 1790 stated that free white persons could become a citizen after living in the nation for at least 2 years. This helped to result the arrival of around 100,000 European immigrants to the United States in the 1790s. However, those not considered to be free and white were excluded by this legislation. Individual states were left to determine whether or not free blacks were considered citizens in their states. In addition, since the Constitution did not consider Native Americans, who were not taxed to be citizens, they were excluded from citizenship until an act of Congress in 1924 changed. This, and even American women had gained the right to vote by that point. Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Although successful, the heavy-handed manner and what some viewed as unconstitutional actions of Hamilton to secure the National Bank and to pay off war debts led to the creation of the first political parties. Hamilton and his followers created the Federalist Party, which promoted a strong central government. Jefferson and James Madison, who opposed Hamilton's view, created the Republicans, or Democratic Republican Party. They stood for the rights of the states and a strict reading of the Constitution. Foreign and domestic crisis. A firestorm of controversy greeted Jay's treaty in America. Opponents of the treaty rioted and burned Jay in effigy. Originally, the French Revolution was viewed in the United States as an action similar to their own in 1776. All that changed in 1792 when France declared war on Prussia and Austria and began to slaughter their nobility. This caused problems in the United States because the Treaty of Alliance with France that was signed in 1778 stated that these two countries were perpetual allies and were obligated to defend each other. Some Americans, however, argue that they had made a treaty with the French monarchy, which was overthrown during the French Revolution. Therefore, they did not have to honor the treaty's obligations. Washington's proclamation of 1793 declared that the United States would remain neutral in the European wars and that any citizen caught aiding in these wars would be prosecuted. This was an attempt to avoid the United States being pulled into another conflict between France and Great Britain and to allow U.S. merchants to continue trading with both nations. The French diplomat to the United States in the early days of the French Revolution was citizen Edmond Genet. Genet had begun hiring privateers to attack Spanish Florida and harass British ships. Washington worried that Genet's actions would lead to America's entrance into the war against England, which he did not want, and demanded Genet's recall. By the time the demand reached France, some revolution had swept out Genet's supporters and his arrest was ordered. Genet begged for asylum to prevent being returned. In the efforts to soothe relations with Great Britain while securing promises to pull British forts out of the Ohio River Valley, John Jay was sent to England. His negotiations secured very few of the demands of Congress, and his treaty, though offensive to many, was ratified to avoid embarrassment abroad. The Whiskey Rebellion. Congress, at Hamilton's request, had levied a tax on whiskey in 1791, which angered farmers for whom it was their principal product. At the time, it was easier to move jugs of whiskey across the Appalachian Mountains than it was mere sheaves of wheat. The farmers feared that this was another attempt to fleece the poor to subsidize the rich. Events erupted in 1794 in western Pennsylvania, where federal revenue officers were being terrorized. The spirit of '76 and local liberty versus the national order. Washington called out the militia and 15,000 troops, but by the time they got there, the rebels had vanished. A few were captured and marched in irons through Philadelphia, but the rebellion had ended, although 2 were convicted for treason. In May of 1795, Washington would pardon them. Thomas Jefferson's reaction believed that Washington had went too far, but Hamilton saw it as a different view, that by using the force of the government to put down a rebellion, which the government was able not to do when you looked at Shays' rebellion. This is also the last time and only time that a president of the United States wore a military uniform. Pinckney's Treaty. The Treaty of San Lorenzo, or Pinckney's Treaty, October 1795. One positive result of Jay's Treaty was this one between the United States and Spain, who feared that the U.S. was about to come to terms with Great Britain. Differences regarding the southern and western boundaries and free navigation by the Americans of the Mississippi were adjusted. United States Minister to Great Britain, Thomas Pinckney, achieved Spanish recognition of the U.S. boundary claims under the Treaty of 1783. The Mississippi to the west side, the 31st parallel to the south, and free navigation in the Mississippi, with the right to deposit goods at New Orleans duty-free for 3 years. In Pinckney's Treaty of 1795, Thomas Pinckney secured the use of New Orleans and the land north of the 31st parallel to the Tennessee River and west to the Mississippi. Transfer of power. George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette at Mount Vernon in 1784 is shown in this painting here. Washington enlarged the estate, which overlooked the Potomac River, to nearly 8,000 acres, dividing it among 5 farms. But after serving 2 terms in office, Washington was ready to retire. In his farewell address to the nation, he called for the American citizens to forego political parties, as well as to avoid entangling alliances with the foreign nations. Washington believed that political parties will tear the nation apart, and that political parties would be more interested in the power of the party than what's doing good for the country and the government. In all 3 elections for president prior to 1804, the candidates with the second highest number of votes would become vice president. After the 1800 election, this was discontinued and replaced with a process outlined in the 12th Amendment. In the 1796 election, John Adams won the presidency, and Thomas Jefferson became vice president, even though they were of 2 different parties. The Adams administration. Political philosopher and politician, Adams is the first president to take up residence in the White House in early 1801. By the time Adams came into office, the United States was in an undeclared war with France. Over 300 American ships had been plundered by French ships, and the United States had broken off diplomatic relations with the former ally. In the effort to prevent a declared war, Adams sent a delegation to France to seek a diplomatic end. Before the delegation was allowed to meet with their French counterparts, 3 French officials, who Adams named X, Y, and Z, his report to the Congress, demanded a bribe before they would gain an audience. When this became known in the United States, it was greeted with a cry for war with France. French officials, realizing their mistake, apologized. To counteract what was conceived as a Republican attempt to undermine his presidency, Adams signed the following acts, thus committing the greatest mistake of his presidency and therefore dooming any chance for re-election. The Naturalization Act changed the time period to become a citizen from 5 to 14 years of residency, since most people who were becoming citizens were voting for the Republicans, not the Federalists. The Alien Act empowered the presidency with the ability to deport dangerous aliens. And the Aliens Enemies Act was designed to expel from America enemy aliens at will during a time of war. The Sedition Act forbade writing, publishing, or speaking ill of the government or its officers. Of course, this could be looked upon as, violations of the First Amendment. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Two states, Virginia, led by James Madison in December of 1798, and Kentucky, drafted by Thomas Jefferson 1798-99, passed resolutions invoking the compact theory of government, where the national government exercised powers not specifically delegated to it. Each state has an equal right to judge for itself. In other words, the resolutions advocated the right of the state to declare national acts unconstitutional and declared the Alien Sedition Acts unconstitutional. Although no way yet existed to test the constitutionality of congressional acts, it was generally felt that the states could not. No other state joined them in the similar actions, and several northern states suggested that the judiciary was an exclusive arbitrator of constitutionality. Both states reaffirmed their amendment to the Union, and no other action was taken. The election of 1800. The Federalists portrayed Jefferson as a godless revolutionary, an atheist, and a Jacobin, who, if the godless Jefferson was elected, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be often taught and practiced. The Republicans claimed and portrayed Adams as a monarchist, determined to undo the revolution, and claimed that John Adams was a hideous, hermaphroditical character with neither the fitness of a man or a gentleness of a sensibility of a woman, adding that he was bald, crippled, toothless, and wants to start a war with France. By associating their Federalist opponents with the hated Tories of the American Revolution, the Republicans appealed to the voters as the true defenders of American liberation. The Republicans developed strong party organization and mobilized voters. Voter turnout in 1800 doubled that of the early 1790s, and most new voters were Republicans. A lot of this had to deal with the power behind Aaron Burr and his New York political party machine. When the members of the Electoral College met and were given 2 votes each, instead of voting twice for Jefferson, they cast one ballot for Jefferson for president and one ballot for Burr, thinking to elect him as vice president. However, the final tally was 73 electoral votes for Jefferson and 73 electoral votes for Burr. It was a tie, and Burr wouldn't step down. Now, since there was not a majority, the vote had to go to the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, it became very heatedly debated behind closed doors. Each state was able to cast one vote for president, and it actually took Jefferson's political enemy, Alexander Hamilton, to convince the New York members of Congress to cast their vote for Jefferson, because Hamilton hated Burr so much and said at least Jefferson has values. So Jefferson became president and Burr his vice president. The Federalist Party was now fragmented and weakened.
Unit of study, we're going to look at the early Republic of the United States, 1800 to 1815. The painting that you see before you is Sacagawea, who is pointing out to Meriwether Lewis and his partner Clark on horseback as they crossed and transverse across the great American continent. Jefferson in office is first to act as party leader, cultivating congressional members. His Secretary of State James Madison, Treasury Albert Gallatin, respected by both Republicans and Federalists. Marbury versus Madison, 1803. Midnight appointments. Before he left office, John Adams was scared with a complete Republican takeover of the government, and he appointed many judges to the federal bench before he left office. One would be John Marshall to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Jefferson's administration faced its first serious crisis with the controversial effort to repeal the judgeships established by the Judiciary Act of 1801 and the resulting landmark case of Marbury v. Madison in 1803. The Federalists had passed the Judiciary Act of 1801 just before Adams left office, and the Jeffersonian Republicans rose to power. After his defeat for re-election, Adams and the Federalist Senate had used the legislation to appoint people to the positions on the judiciary across the land. This meant that the judicial branch was the only Federalist-controlled branch of the government, while the Republicans controlled the presidency and the Congress. All that was waiting for Adams-appointed justices is to take their positions was their letters of appointment, which the new government refused to deliver. William Marbury, one of those who failed to receive the letter. When Secretary of State James Madison refused to give it to him, he sued Madison, stating that the Supreme Court, under the Judiciary Act of 1789, had the power to force Madison to give him, known as a writ of mandamus. In a surprise move, the Supreme Court, led by Adams-appointed Chief Justice John Marshall, who was also Jefferson's cousin, instead of siding with Marbury, declared Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional, as laws of the Congress cannot give the Supreme Court powers. Although it was a loss for Marbury, it was a win for the Supreme Court, as it appropriated a power that had never been given. This power became known as judicial review. Western expansion. Problems with the control of New Orleans had existed since the Treaty of Paris of 1783. France's inability to conquer Haiti and the resumption of hostilities with Great Britain, for which France needed cash, led Napoleon to abandon his hopes of a renewed New World Empire. Jefferson had sent a delegation to buy it from the current owner, France, instead of just agreeing to let America buy it, which was New Orleans. Napoleon offered all the Louisiana Territory for $15 million. American envoys agreed to the price of $11,250,000 plus the settlement of $3,750,000 owed by France to U.S. citizens for the entire province. They exceeded their instructions, but the cost would come to 3.5 cents an acre. The purchase of Louisiana doubled the area of the United States with a tract of 828,000 square miles, 140% of the area of the original 13 states between Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains. Although exact boundaries were not defined between Spanish territory and Louisiana, because the Constitution made no provision for purchasing and assimilating foreign territory, this issue perplexed Jefferson, who, in principle, was a strict constructionist, but adopted a broad view here. While Federalists normally were broad, they took a strict interpretive view, the hypocrisy of politics. The Senate approved the treaty by a vote of 24-7 on October 20, 1800. C.C. Claiborne was named territorial governor of Louisiana, and in fact, he controlled more area than Jefferson did as president. In 1812, Louisiana would become the first state to come out of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, since you've already bought the land, the next step seems logical. What did we buy? So to discover the extent of the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the land west of the Mississippi to record the resources and terrain and meet with the Native Americans and others that they might meet along the way. They had a crew of about 30 men, known as the Corps of Discovery,
which would travel from St. Louis in the former French and Spanish territory to the Pacific Ocean and back. It took about 28 months. Even though the Pacific coast was not part of the Louisiana Purchase, it did give the United States the opportunity to try to stake a claim in Oregon. The purpose also was to see if they could find the famous Northwest Passage. In the spring of 1805, the Corps of Discovery added a French trapper and his wife, a Shoshone woman, Sacagawea, meaning bird woman, served as their interpreter and guide, and she was a remarkable woman that allowed to be able to communicate with the natives that Lewis and Clark could not. Now, since you've already bought the land, the next step seems logical. What did we buy? So to discover the extent of the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the land west of the Mississippi to record the resources and terrain and meet with the Native Americans and others that they might meet along the way. They had a crew of about 30 men known as the Corps of Discovery, which would travel from St. Louis in the former French and Spanish territory to the Pacific Ocean and back. It took about 28 months. Even though the Pacific coast was not part of the Louisiana Purchase, it did give the United States the opportunity to try to stake a claim in Oregon. The purpose also was to see if they could find the famous Northwest Passage. In the spring of 1805, the Corps of Discovery added a French trapper and his wife, a Shoshone woman, Sacagawea, meaning bird woman, served as their interpreter and guide, and she was a remarkable woman that allowed to be able to communicate with the natives that Lewis and Clark could not. Now, since you've already bought the land, the next step seems logical. What did we buy? So to discover the extent of the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the land west of the Mississippi to record the resources and terrain and meet with the Native Americans and others that they might meet along the way. They had a crew of about 30 men known as the Corps of Discovery, which would travel from St. Louis in the former French and Spanish territory to the Pacific Ocean and back. It took about 28 months. Even though the Pacific coast was not part of the Louisiana Purchase, it did give the United States the opportunity to try to stake a claim in Oregon. The purpose also was to see if they could find the famous Northwest Passage. In the spring of 1805, the Corps of Discovery added a French trapper and his wife, a Shoshone woman, Sacagawea, meaning bird woman, served as their interpreter and guide, and she was a remarkable woman that allowed to be able to communicate with the natives that Lewis and Clark could not. Ending of the slave trade. The Constitution forbade interference with the slave trade for 20 years. Jefferson recommended that Congress stop the importation of slaves into the United States. Congress would forbid the bringing of slaves into the U.S. after January 1st, 1808. Impressment. British countermeasures between 1804 and 1805. Britain's West Indian policy was designed to destroy neutral commerce with France and Spanish colonies in America, but furnished staples to Napoleon's army. Britain countered French decrees with the Orders in Council, blocking all trade with France or its allies, closing all ports not open to the British flag. Britain began to seize any ships headed for French ports, forcing American ships into British ports, where both ships and cargo were sometimes seized. Neutral ships were not recognized by either side. Britain insisted that all neutral ships must be checked first in the British ports before proceeding to their destination. France declared that if a neutral ship went to a British port, it would be assumed that it was now a British ship and would be treated as a prize of war. What angered the United States was the British policy of impressment, or the stopping of U.S. ships and seizing some sailors on board, impressing them into the service of the British Navy, insisting that these were either deserters or still British citizens, refusing to recognize U.S. naturalization laws. Some of them were former British sailors, but the harshness and the brutality of the Royal Navy made it very easy for some of these guys to jump ship, come to the United States, and then join the American Merchant Marine. Between 1793 and 1811, the British seized an estimated 10,000 sailors from U.S. ships, especially English-born U.S. citizens. The peak years were 1808 to 1811, when 6,000 were pressed into service. But it should be noted that the U.S. Merchant Marines and the Navy encouraged British naval deserters to enlist, offering higher wages and much better treatment compared with the strict discipline on British naval ships, and also aided British seamen in securing false naturalization papers. The embargo. As a last-ditch effort, Jefferson supported an embargo, which allowed no exports from the U.S. to any country and restricted imports of certain British products. It prohibited merchants from trading with Europe. It also forbade all U.S. ships from leaving for foreign ports and did not allow many foreign vessels to leave U.S. ports without U.S. goods. It represented President Jefferson's belief in a peaceful coercion. It failed to cause England and France to change their trade policies. Although Federalists tried to block it, it passed the Senate 22-6 and the House supported by the South and the West by 82-44. This action made Jefferson very unpopular, especially in the Federalist strongholds and along the Atlantic coastline. Means for evading the provisions were developed. A brisk smuggling trade developed on land and water, particularly between New England and New York and Canada. The British cooperated with U.S. merchants who violated the law. Its results did not bring Britain to its knees because England was not as dependent on U.S. goods as was thought. It hurt English wage earners, Caribbean planters and slaves, but not the upper class. These lower class, being non-voters, had little clout in Parliament. The only country that was truly hurt by this embargo was the United States, although non-importation helped spur the creation of more U.S.-based industry over time. The War of 1812, and sometimes referred to as historians as the Second American Revolution, will be the first time that the president will ask for a declaration of war against a foreign nation. Shipping rights and national honor. The main reason for declaring war on Great Britain was for the violation of American shipping rights. The government pushed for freedom of the seas, the ability of neutral nations to trade with any nation in the world, even if that nation was at war. The vote was cast along sectional basis, New England voting 20-12 against going to war. Another reason was the instigation of Native Americans by British citizens to attack the states, which led to support from western and southern states, who saw an opportunity to grab East Florida. Some Americans were also interested in the conquest of Canada and Florida, and even Henry Clay of Kentucky advocating commerce, character, a nation's best treasure, honor. The Warhawks. In the elections of 1812, many new Western and Southern congressmen like Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Andrew Jackson of Tennessee from agrarian frontier areas were pro-expansionist, anti-British, and pushed for war with Britain. American fur traders clashed with British fur traders in the Ohio Valley and the now area regarded as U.S. territory, although Jay's Treaty allowed this. These congressional Warhawks, called by John Randolph, although a minority in Congress, became more vocal in the pursuit of war with Great Britain. Although not really affected by the maritime issues as the Atlantic seacoast, they viewed British maritime seizure and impressment as an outrage against national honor, and equated U.S. security with land hunger, and combined with the desire for Canada, with the Southerners' desire for Florida from Spain, Britain's ally. Some scholars have now suggested that the War of 1812 was a second American War of Independence. Some in the U.S., perhaps even Madison himself, were fearful that Britain was taking the U.S. too leniently and did not perceive them as a serious nation. While certainly not the major consideration, the War of 1812 did end all the hostilities between the British and the United States, in which both nations grew closer together diplomatically. The Congressional Warhawks, the 40 new elected representatives from the West and the South that were elected to the 12th Congress, were led by Henry Clay, who became the Speaker of the House, pushed Madison to call for a declaration of war against Britain because only a vigorous demonstration in behalf of Americans' rights would show the validity of the new Republic experiment. Congress authorized the President to call up state militias for 6 months' service in April of 1812. Pro-British maritime and commercial interests in the East forced a close vote. On 18 June, the House voted for war 79 to 49. The Senate voted 19 to 13. Pennsylvania and Virginia represented 30 of the pro-war vote. New York and Massachusetts represented 20 of the anti-war vote. South Carolina, Georgia, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee unanimously voted for war. Delaware, Rhode Island, and Connecticut unanimously opposed it. And on June 19th, a state of war was declared by Madison. The four major causes were listed as the following. 1. Impressment of U.S. sailors. 2. Violation of U.S. neutrality rights and territorial waters. 3. Blockade of U.S. ports. And 4. Refusal to revoke the orders of council. Ironically, one cause, the orders in council, was removed 2 days before war was declared, on May 11, 1812. The British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval was assassinated, which threw the British government into turmoil temporarily. The new British Prime Minister, forming Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh, suspended the orders of council, but it was too late to notify the United States before its declaration. A Continental War. 3 different wars were fought on different fronts during this engagement. Andrew Jackson led the forces in the southeastern part of the United States, culminating in the Battle of New Orleans. The second front was fought at sea between the United States and British navies. Captain Isaac Hull of the USS Constitution won a much-needed victory over the British frigate Gowerra. Captain Stephen Decatur of the USS United States defeated the British frigate HMS Macedonia off the Madeira Islands. And Captain William Bainbridge, the new commander of the USS Constitution, defeated the British frigate Java, a battle which earned the ship the name Old Ironsides, due to the cannonballs bouncing off their hull. The third was fought along the Great Lakes region, the burning of Washington. In August of 1814, supporting a Canadian campaign, 4,000 British troops created a diversion on the U.S. coast. Britain had 3 aims: to seize or destroy the flotilla of gunboats under the shelter in the Appomattox, to descend on Baltimore, and to raid Alexandria and Washington, D.C. As the British approached, gunboats in the Appomattox were abandoned and destroyed by U.S. forces in retreat. At the Battle of Bladensburg, an incompetent general, William H. Windsor, U.S. commander of the Potomac District, with a mixed force of 7,000, was routed by 3,000 British forces and was forced to withdraw to Georgetown, a suburb of the District of Columbia. U.S. government officials and a panic-stricken army fled as British forces marched unopposed into Washington, D.C., and set fire to all public buildings except the Patent Office, inflicting over $1.5 million in damages before a storm forced the retreat. Madison was on horseback, carrying with him the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. His wife Dolly stayed until the last, taking the portrait of George Washington. After the war was over, the gray-colored executive building, in order to hide the burn marks of which it was torched by the British Army, was painted white, and from henceforth would be called the White House. While the British were destroying Washington, D.C., citizens of Baltimore established an elaborate defensive works. Britain would then land forces bogged down while trying bombarding Fort McHenry, which protected the entrance towards Baltimore. Here they were very unsuccessful. It was during this bombardment at Fort McHenry that the StarSpangled Banner would be written by Francis Scott Key and would be sung to the tune of a British bar song. Britain would abandon the taking of Baltimore and sailing to Jamaica in October. Francis Scott Key's poem of the Star-Spangled Banner, we only sing the first of 3 verses. Later on, it will become our national anthem. Aftermath of the war. Peace proposals. Tsar Alexander I of Russia offered to mediate the Anglo-US differences because of Napoleon's declaration of war against Russia, an ally of Britain. Castlereagh refused mediation, but having tired of war, offered Monroe direct mediation. Madison accepted the offer and appointed John Quincy Adams, J. A. Bayard, Henry Clay, and Jonathan Russell as peace commissioners. Ghent, Belgium, was chosen as the meeting place, and discussions began in August of 1814. U.S. envoys were instructed to obtain satisfaction on impressment and other British maritime infractions against the U.S. Concerning territory the U.S. desired, the status quo of the antebellum pre-war conditions. British envoys desired a neutral Indian buffer state in the Northwest and territorial concessions between Maine and Lake Superior, about one-third of U.S. territory, and insisted, especially after the burning of the U.S. national capital, on ute possidetis, retention of territory actually held. After news of Macdonough's victory on Lake Champlain, the Americans rejected British terms. The Duke of Wellington told his government that the setbacks on the Great Lakes area did not entitle Britain to demand cessation of any territory, because Britain had a depleted treasury and was diplomatically embarrassed at the Congress of Vienna. They conceded to U.S. territorial view. The terms of the treaty restored the peace, but didn't address the issue over which Great Britain and the United States had fought the war in the first place. It did provide for the release of prisoners, restoration of all conquered territory, British, not Spanish, and a commission to settle the disputed U.S.-Canadian Northwest boundary. It left to the future the questions of disarmament on the Great Lakes and the use of fisheries off Newfoundland. The treaty was unanimously ratified by the Senate in February of 1815. The Battle of New Orleans. Jackson traveled through Mobile and arrived in New Orleans on 1st December 1814. It should be noted that Great Britain sent troops to New Orleans even while negotiations at Ghent were being held, which suggested they might have ignored the terms of Ghent if they had won. 7,500 veteran British soldiers under Sir Edward Packham left Jamaica and sailed through the Gulf of Mexico in order to assault New Orleans, although it took 1 week to disembark. Jackson, with a main defense at Baton Rouge, learned that the British landed 40 miles east of New Orleans, after which he hurried his forces to New Orleans to oppose British forces massing there. Martial law was proclaimed in New Orleans, although the British marched to within 7 miles of the city without being detected. Jackson led 5,000 in a night attack against the British and stopped their advance. He quickly constructed defensive works, and the Americans outgunned the British on January 1, 1815, in a furious artillery battle. Jackson, with 4,500 regulars, many from Tennessee and Kentucky, held off 2 direct assaults by the British, who suffered heavy casualties on January 8th. The 1-hour battle resulted in Packham and 2 other British officers' deaths and 2,036 British casualties against only 21 U.S. casualties. The British would withdraw on January 27th. The decisive American War of 1812 victory over British troops in January that it ended the British hopes of gaining control of the lower Mississippi River Valley, even though the battle was fought after the war was over.